In the autumn of 1879, as many as 100,000 people boarded trains to a small Lancashire seaside town to stand on a promenade and stare at 8 electric lamps. No ride to queue for, no show to watch, only the light thrown across the sand a full year before Edison would patent his bulb. Today, more than 20 million visits are still made to that same town, but almost nobody comes for the reason those 100,000 did, and the street where the lamps once burned is now among the poorest in England. The town is Blackpool, and for the better part of 80 years it was the closest thing the British working class ever built to a promised land. At its height in the 1950s, close to 17 million people came here every year, most of them from the cotton and coal towns of the north, and most of them stayed for a week. They slept in seafront boarding houses, danced under a tower modelled on the one in Paris, and went home sunburned and penniless and already saving for the next time. 21.5 million visits were still counted in 2023, so the crowds never really stopped coming. It is the week they used to stay for that has gone, and with it the entire world that the week once paid for. The boarding houses that once filled every summer now hold the cheapest rented rooms in the country. To understand how far the town fell, we have first to see how impossibly high it climbed. It sits on a flat, wind-blown stretch of the Lancashire coast with no natural harbour, no river worth the name, and no obvious reason for anyone to build there. In 1801, the whole settlement amounted to 473 people scattered in cottages behind the dunes, with a faintly medicinal fashion for sea bathing and a handful of lodging houses. A local man named Henry Banks bought up the Lane Ends estate and put up the first purpose-built holiday cottages, but for decades it remained a quiet, remote spot where the land ran out into the Irish Sea. Then, in 1846, the railway arrived. A branch line reached the town from Poulton, joining Blackpool by iron to the vast industrial interior of Lancashire, to Preston and Bolton and Burnley and Oldham. Those towns held hundreds of thousands of cotton workers and their families, people who worked brutal hours in the spinning sheds and who had, until then, no realistic means of ever seeing the sea. A place that had drawn a trickle of the genteel now sat one cheap excursion fare away from the largest concentration of industrial workers on earth. And those workers came in a way that had never happened anywhere before, because of a peculiar Lancashire institution called the Wakes Weeks. Each mill town closed down completely for one designated week. The machines stopped for maintenance and every worker released at once. The towns staggered their weeks across the summer, so the whole of industrial Lancashire did not empty at once, and when a town's week came round, it did not send a few families to the coast. It sent almost everyone. In 1860, more than 23,000 people travelled from Oldham alone to Blackpool by train in a single week, and a working town would fall silent behind them, its streets deserted, its chimneys cold, while its entire population stood on a beach 60 miles away. A Blackpool landlady could tell which town was in residence by the accents on her stairs. For the children of the mills it was the single fixed point of the year, save for in a holiday club penny by penny from the previous autumn. The numbers this produced are difficult to hold in the mind. That village of 473 grew to 14,000 by 1881, to 47,000 by 1901, and to 147,000 by 1951. Blackpool became one of the fastest growing towns in the country, and unlike the mill towns it fed on, it produced nothing at all. It made no cloth, forged no steel, mined no coal. Its only industry was pleasure, and pleasure, sold cheaply enough to millions of tired people, turned out to be one of the most profitable trades in Victorian Britain. The town understood this early, and it began to build. In 1878, on an estate bought 3 years before for £28,000, Blackpool opened the Winter Gardens, a vast glass and iron pleasure palace that cost around £100,000 to raise. Inside were covered promenades and a great hall, and in time the Empress Ballroom, with space for 3,000 dancers beneath an arched roof, and an opera house seating more than 2,800, one of the largest theatres in the country. The idea was to sell the seaside, even when the Lancashire weather turned grey and wet. You did not depend on the sun. You built the sun indoors, in glass and gaslight, and before long, in electricity. The piers came too, one after another. The North Pier opened in 1863, the work of the great pier engineer Eugenius Birch, and set itself up as the respectable one, the place for a quiet promenade and a band. The Central Pier followed in 1868 and went the other way, into open-air dancing and cheap amusements for the day trippers pouring off the trains. The South Pier, the last and shortest, arrived in 1893. No other resort in Britain felt the need for so many, because none had so many people to entertain. And in 1879 came the lamps. Having watched the first experiments with electric arc lighting on the continent, the town's leaders voted £5,000 to try it on the promenade. They set up 8 carbon arc lamps along the front, powered by steam engines driving Siemens dynamos. Blackpool was not, whatever the postcards later claimed, the first place on earth to switch on an electric streetlight. Paris and Newcastle had both got there first, but it was among the very first to light an entire seafront this way, and it grasped what the light was truly for. The lamps were not about seeing in the dark, they were a spectacle, a reason to travel, and the town advertised them as artificial sunshine and watched the excursion trains fill. Those crowds of up to 100,000 standing in the salt wind to look at electric light for its own sake are the moment Blackpool worked out its future in a single evening. Give the working man something he has never seen, price it within his reach, and he will cross the whole of a county to stand in front of it. Once it had learned that lesson, the town never stopped repeating it. By 1885, Blackpool had laid an electric street tramway along the front, the first of its kind in the country. The illuminations grew from a curiosity into an institution. In 1912, to mark a royal visit by Princess Louise, the town strung the front with some 10,000 coloured bulbs, and the crowds were so large that the show was brought back year after year, stretched out to hold visitors well into the autumn after the summer season ended. Blackpool had learned to sell light itself, turning the dark end of the year into a reason to buy another train ticket. In time, the switch-on became a national event, the honour handed to a film star or a singer or a television face, proof that the lights could still summon the country long after the summer trade had thinned. But all of this, the piers and the palaces and the trams and the lights, was only the prologue to the thing that would come to stand for Blackpool in the mind of the entire nation. In 1891, a group of local businessmen, led by the town's former mayor John Bickerstaff, laid the foundation stone for a tower. They had seen Gustave Eiffel's tower rise over Paris and wanted one of their own on the Lancashire coast, set over a great red brick building that would hold a circus, an aquarium and a ballroom all at once. They commissioned 2 architects, James Maxwell and Charles Tuke, and the engineers Heenan and Froude to build it. It took 3 years and more than 2,500 tons of steel and around 90 tons of cast iron, and cost in the region of £290,000. Blackpool Tower opened on Whit Monday, the 14th of May 1894. At 518 feet, it was then the tallest man-made structure in the entire British Empire. For sixpence, a visitor could step inside, and for a few pennies more, ride the lift toward the top, watch the circus perform in the base, or wander among the tanks of the aquarium below. And yet the quiet detail behind the triumph is that neither man who designed it lived to see it finished. Both James Maxwell and Charles Tuke died before it was complete, so the two who first imagined that skyline never once stood beneath it, looking up. Inside the base of the tower, opened a few years later at the very end of the century, was the room that would carry Blackpool's name further than the steel above it ever could. The Tower Ballroom was the work of Frank Matcham, the most gifted theatre architect of the age, pure gilded excess, tier upon tier of gold and crimson, wrapped around a sprung dance floor laid from more than 30,000 blocks of oak, mahogany and walnut. Into this room, in 1930, came an organist from Sheffield named Reginald Dixon, and he sat down at the mighty Wurlitzer that rose out of the floor and began to play. He would keep playing there for 40 years until 1970, broadcasting to the whole country over the wireless, selling more records than any organist before him, and becoming so bound up with the place that people simply called him Mr. Blackpool. His signature tune, the one that meant the seaside to millions who never saw the ballroom, was I do like to be beside the seaside. The ballroom's reign was very nearly cut short. In 1956, a fire tore through it, gutting the great room and its painted ceiling and threatening to take the heart out of the tower for good. It closed for 2 years while craftsmen rebuilt what the flames had taken, matching the gold leaf and the plasterwork tier by tier, and when it reopened in 1958, it was as though nothing had happened. A room could burn to its frame, and the town would simply put it back, so certain was it the crowds would return. While the tower rose in the centre of town, another empire was taking shape at its southern end, out on the open sand. In 1896, a fairground operator named William George Bean began assembling rides on a stretch of dune, and with his partner John Outhwaite built what became the Pleasure Beach. In time, one of the great amusement parks of the world. One of its earliest rides, Sir Hiram Maxim's captive flying machine, went up in 1904 and is still turning today, the oldest amusement ride still operating anywhere in Europe. In 1923 came the Big Dipper, a wooden roller coaster that gave a whole generation its first taste of engineered fear. The Pleasure Beach stayed in the hands of a single family down the decades, and at its peak drew more than 5 million visitors in a year. And still the building went on. The Grand Theatre, another Matcham design, opened in 1894, thrown up in a remarkable 7 months for around £20,000, with a brief, so the story goes, simply to build the prettiest theatre in the land. No single town in Britain had ever concentrated so much pleasure in one place, aimed so squarely at ordinary working people, and none ever would again. Holding the whole machine together was a small and formidable institution that never appears on a postcard, the landlady. Behind the grand front stood street after street of terraced boarding houses, thousands of them, each run by a woman who let her rooms by the week through the season, and ruled them with a discipline that became a national joke and a national legend at once. There were rules about meal times and keys and no visitors after a certain hour, and a family that had come for freedom found itself, gently but firmly, kept in line by the woman of the house. It was on the backs of these landladies that the entire economy rested. They turned the town's ordinary housing into its greatest asset. By the middle of the 20th century, Blackpool had arrived at a peak that now seems almost mythical, close to 17 million visitors a year, and a population that peaked in 1961 at over 153,000. In the high summer of the wakes, the beach was a solid carpet of bodies, the boarding houses booked months ahead, the trams packed from Stargate to the north. On a wake Saturday, the excursion trains arrived through the small hours, unloading tens of thousands who had left Lancashire in the dark, and by midday, the great beach between the piers was a single moving mass, deck chairs and donkeys and paddling children down to the waterline. A family walked to a terraced house a few streets back from the front, and for one glorious week, lived a life unlike the one they had left in the mill town. They ate meals they had not cooked, slept in a bed made by someone else, and were for 6 or 7 days free. What Blackpool sold in the end was freedom itself, rented out by the week, at a price the working man could just about meet. Which is what makes what happened next so hard to watch, because the very thing that had built all of this was about to be turned against it. The first sign that the ground was shifting came, oddly enough, in the form of triumph. In 1994, exactly 100 years after the tower opened, the Pleasure Beach unveiled a new roller coaster called the Big One. It cost around £12 million and reached a structural height of 213 feet, and on the day it opened, it was the tallest, fastest and steepest roller coaster in the world. The marketing men measured it against the level of the sea instead and called it 235 feet. And for a season, Blackpool once again held a world record, a giant of steel seen for miles across the field. It was the last great gesture of the old confidence. But even as the Big One climbed into the sky, the crowds it was built to thrill were already leaving, pulled away by a force Blackpool could not outbuild. That force was the package holiday. From the early 1960s, cheaper air travel and the block booking of Spanish hotels put something new within reach of the very people Blackpool depended on. For roughly the price of a wet week in a Lancashire boarding house, a family could now fly to the Costa del Sol or Benidorm and lie in guaranteed sunshine on a Mediterranean beach. Within a decade, Fishing villages like Benidorm swelled into forests of concrete hotels built for exactly this trade. A Lancashire fortnight might hand a family grey skies and a cold wind off the Irish Sea for 6 days out of 7, and no quantity of indoor ballrooms could change that. Spain sold sun you could count on, and here is the cruel symmetry at the heart of it. What had made Blackpool possible was cheap travel for the ordinary worker. The excursion train had carried him to the Lancashire coast because it was the furthest his money could reach. Now the charter flight carried that same worker, or more often his children, straight over Blackpool and out to Spain, because the price of distance had collapsed again. The machine that built the town was the machine that emptied it. Blackpool's true rival in the end was the sun itself, now sold to the mill towns at a price they could at last afford, and the mill towns themselves were dying, which took away the other half of the equation. Through the 1960s, 70s and 80s, the Lancashire cotton industry collapsed under foreign competition. The great spinning sheds fell silent for good, and with them went the wakes weeks that had timed Blackpool's entire year. The custom made sense when a whole town worked the same mill on the same shifts. When the mills closed, that clockwork fell apart, and the reliable tide of Wakes Week visitors simply stopped. The town had been built to serve a particular kind of worker, living a particular kind of life, and across a single generation, that worker and that life ceased to exist. Even the roads conspired against the old model. In 1975, the M55 motorway reached Blackpool, and while it was meant to bring visitors in, it quietly changed the shape of what a visit was. A family that had once needed a week in a boarding house because the journey was slow could now drive up in the morning and be home by night. The staying visitor, who filled a bedroom for 6 nights and ate every meal in the town, began to give way to the day tripper, who arrived, spent a few pounds on the front, and left before dark. The beds that were Blackpool's whole economy started quietly to empty, but that was only the visible half. The deeper change was taking place inside those buildings, and would prove far harder to undo than any bad season in the trade. The decline of a great resort is rarely a single dramatic collapse. It is a slow leak, a few thousand fewer beds filled each season, a few more boarding houses that do not reopen in the spring, until one day the town looks around and finds that the world it was built for is simply no longer there. Across the 1990s, the number of visitors fell by roughly a third from its post-war levels, and the staying trade collapsed far faster than the raw headcount suggests. Around 1,000 hotels and guesthouses stopped trading. Average occupancy in the places that survived fell as low as 1 room in 4. By the turn of the century, some seafront boarding houses were letting rooms for as little as £10 a night simply to keep the lights on, and even that could not fill them. The town that had turned visitors away in its pomp now could not give its beds away. And once the beds stood empty, the question that would come to define modern Blackpool began, grimly, to answer itself. What do you do with a town made almost entirely of boarding houses when nobody wants to board? The answer, it turned out, was to chase whatever custom was left, and the custom that was left was thirsty. Through the 90s and the 2000s, Blackpool leaned into the stag and hen trade, the cheap weekend of drinking that its empty seafront rooms and cheap beds could absorb. It kept the tills ringing for a while, but hollowed the place out in a different way, trading the family that came for a week, and remembered it for a lifetime for the group that came for a night, and remembered very little. The resort that had sold wholesome freedom to the respectable poor found itself selling something harder-edged, and its old reputation curdled accordingly. Underneath the drinking trade, a far quieter transformation was taking hold. Across the same years, thousands of the old guest houses, the terraced Victorian buildings that had once held happy families for a week at a time, were carved up into houses in multiple occupation, small cheap bedsits let by the room. By the mid-2010s, the council counted around 4,000 such properties, most clustered in the inner streets just back from the shining front, in wards with names like Central and Bloomfield and Talbot. An estimated 23,000 people came to live in these converted rooms, many among the most vulnerable in the country, drawn to Blackpool precisely because the rents had fallen so far. The very cheapness that had once made a Blackpool holiday possible for a mill family now made a Blackpool bedsit the last affordable address in Britain. The council described it in one planning decision as a significant oversupply of poor quality accommodation, which is bureaucratic language for a tragedy. And what became of the landladies, the women who had been the backbone of the whole enterprise? Some held on, taking in the new lodgers the benefits system sent them, their front rooms now let by the month and the year to people with nowhere else to go. Others sold up to landlords who bought whole terraces cheaply and split each house into as many rooms as the walls would allow. The institution that had once meant a remembered breakfast and a firm word about the front door key became, without anyone quite deciding it, the machinery of the poorest housing market in the country. And the human cost is now measurable in the most final terms there are. Blackpool has become the most deprived local authority in England. When the government published its latest indices of deprivation in 2025, 7 of the 10 most deprived neighbourhoods in the whole of England were found inside this one town. 2 in every 5 of Blackpool's neighbourhoods sit in the most deprived 10th of the country. The Bloomfield area, tucked behind the football ground, within sight of the tower, ranked as the single most deprived ward in England and Wales. This is not the deprivation of a remote and forgotten village. It is concentrated in the heart of what was once the most joyful square mile in British life, a few streets back from a beach millions once crossed the north to reach. The starkest figure of all is the one that measures how long the people of Blackpool now live. In the years around 2021 to 2023, for the first time since such records began, Blackpool overtook Glasgow to record the lowest male life expectancy anywhere in Great Britain, at just over 73 years, and the most recent figures show it holding that unwanted place. A boy born today in the town that once sold the working class its brightest week of the year can expect to live around 6 years less than the English average. Worse, he can expect only around 50 years of good health before illness sets in, roughly a decade short of the national figure, so that much of even that shortened life is spent unwell. Blackpool leads the country too, in the share of its working age population claiming health-related benefits, at roughly 1 person in 5, several times higher than in the most comfortable corners of the south. Broaden the measure to every kind of working age benefit, and the figure climbs toward 2 in 5 of the town's adults of working age. The resort built to give tired bodies 1 week of rest is now, on paper, one of the hardest places in the country simply to stay alive and well. It would be comforting to say all of this fell on Blackpool from outside, and the town was merely unlucky. The truth is heavier. The package holiday was the visible blow, but it landed on a place already built on a single narrow foundation, a place that had staked everything on one kind of customer, living one kind of life. When cheap flights arrived, and the mills closed, and the motorway turned the week into a day, there was nothing else underneath to catch the town as it fell. And in the years after 2010, as central government cut council budgets across the country, Blackpool lost more of its core funding than almost anywhere else in England at the exact moment its problems ran deepest. A place with the greatest need was handed some of the sharpest cuts. Because you can still walk it, and that is the strangest part of all. Blackpool did not vanish. Stand on the promenade now, and almost all of it is still there. The tower still rises over the front, its stonework listed at the highest grade and floodlit at night, its ballroom floor restored and still filling with dancers, still borrowed once a year by the nation's biggest television dance show, so the whole country can watch couples waltz across that famous floor. All 3 piers still reach out over the water. The Winter Garden still stands, bought back by the town itself. The pleasure beach still turns, the big one still climbs, and Sir Hiram Maxim's flying machine, more than 120 years old, still swings its passengers out over the sand. The Grand Theatre, once condemned to demolition, and saved at the 11th hour by an emergency listing and a group of local people who refused to let it go, still raises its curtain. And on an autumn night the promenade still blazes with over 1 million bulbs, 6 miles of illuminations that remain the one thing that reliably draws the crowds back in. Walk 2 streets back from the promenade into the inner wards though, and the change is immediate. The same tall Victorian terraces that once advertised vacancies and sea views now carry the marks of subdivision, a dozen doorbells where there was once one front door, curtains drawn well into the afternoon. The sea is 100 yards away and might as well be 100 miles. This is the other Blackpool, the one the day tripper never sees, and it stands directly behind the one he came to photograph. The town has not stopped fighting either. In recent years it has stretched the tramway onto the main railway station, raised a new conference centre, and built its calendar around great free spectacles, an air show, a fireworks championship, a Christmas festival on the front, all designed to pull the day tripper back down the motorway, and they work, after a fashion. The visitors still come, more than 20 million a year, and tourism is still worth close to £2 billion and supports more than 23,000 jobs, a large share of everything Blackpool has left. The industry that raised the town has never gone, only its shape changed, from the week to the day, from the bedroom to the car park, from the family that stayed to the crowd that passes through. But its population has fallen back to around 142,000, well below the peak of the 1960s, and fewer than 2 in 3 of its working age residents are in work. Blackpool now lives in effect on the memory of itself, offering the day tripper a few bright hours of a place that once gave the whole country a week. So the paradox holds right to the end. Everything that made Blackpool famous is still standing, still lit, still turning. It is something harder to name, a magnificent stage set that has outlived its play, a place where the crowds still gather at the front and the poverty gathers 100 yards behind them, in the very buildings that once meant a week of happiness. The visitors take their pictures beneath the tower, ride the trams their great-grandparents rode, and drive home the same night down the motorway that first taught them not to stay. And the people who do stay, who live in the carved-up boarding houses in the streets behind, endure some of the shortest and hardest lives in the country, in the shadow of a monument to national joy, which brings us back to the lamps. In 1879, 100,000 people crossed the whole of industrial Lancashire to stand in the dark and look at 8 electric lights on a seafront, because someone had understood that ordinary people would travel a very long way towards something bright. Nearly a century and a half later, the descendants of that crowd still come, and the lights are still burning, over 1 million of them now, along the front. They burn over a town that gave the working class of Britain the best week of its year for the better part of a century, and that now, in the streets just behind them, holds the poorest and the shortest lives in the land. The light that first called the country to Blackpool is still on. It is only the reason for coming, and the chance to stay, that have gone out. If this story has stayed with you, the video now waiting on your screen tells another one much like it, the rise and fall of another place that once reached for something extraordinary. I think you will want to see where it goes.